Welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Today we'll be continuing in our series on Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson with Chapter 12, which is entitled The Drive for Exports. As I've mentioned throughout the course of this series, we are doing this read as a parallel read with Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies. So I'll put a link in this video's description to that series so you can follow along there as well. Also, as I've mentioned throughout the course of this series, I'll be doing an analysis and review of each of these reads upon the conclusion of the read. So I'll put a timestamp in this video's description to the analysis and review part of the video so you can jump straight to that if that's how you'd like to go about this. So without further ado, let's dive into today's read, which is Chapter 12, The Drive for Exports. Exceeded only by the pathological dread of imports, that affects all nations is a pathological yearning for exports. Logically, it is true, nothing could be more inconsistent. In the long run, imports and exports must equal each other, considering both in the broadest sense, which includes such quote-unquote invisible items as tourist expenditures, ocean freight charges, and all other items in the quote-unquote balance of payments. It is exports that pay for imports and vice versa. The greater exports we have, the greater imports we must have if we ever expect to get paid. The smaller imports we have, the smaller exports we can have. Without imports, we can have no exports, for foreigners will have no funds with which to buy our goods. When we decide to cut down our imports, we are in effect deciding also to cut down our exports. When we decide to increase our exports, we are in effect deciding also to increase our imports. The reason for this is elementary. An American exporter sells his goods to a British importer and is paid in British pounds sterling. But he cannot use British pounds sterling to pay the wages of his workers, to buy his wife's clothes, or to buy theater tickets. For all these purposes, he needs American dollars. Therefore, his British pounds are of no use to him unless he either uses them himself to buy British goods or sells them through his bank or other agent to some American importer who wishes to use them to buy British goods. Whichever he does, the transaction cannot be completed until the American exports have been paid for by an equal amount of imports. The same situation would exist if the transaction had been conducted in terms of American dollars instead of British pounds. The British importer could not pay the American exporter in dollars unless some previous British exporter had built up a credit in dollars here as a result of some previous sale to us. Foreign exchange, in short, is a clearing transaction in which, in America, the dollar debts of foreigners are canceled against their dollar credits. In England, the pound sterling debts of foreigners are canceled against their sterling credits. There's no reason to go into the technical details of all this, which can be found in any good textbook on foreign exchange. But it should be pointed out that there is nothing inherently mysterious about it, in spite of the mystery in which it is so often wrapped, and that it does not differ essentially from what happens in domestic trade. Each of us must also sell something, even if for most of us it is our own services rather than goods, in order to get the purchasing power to buy. Domestic trade is also conducted in the main by crossing off checks and other claims against each other through clearinghouses. It is true that under the international gold standard, discrepancies in balances of imports and exports were sometimes settled by shipments of gold. But they could just as well have been settled by shipments of cotton, steel, whiskey, perfume, or any other commodity. The chief difference is that when a gold standard exists, the demand for gold is almost indefinitely expansible, partly because it is thought of and accepted as a residual international money, rather than as just another commodity, and that nations do not put artificial obstacles in the way of receiving gold as they do in the way of receiving almost everything else. On the other hand, of late years they have taken to putting more obstacles in the way of exporting gold than in the way of exporting anything else, but that is another story. Now, the same people who can be clear-headed and sensible when the subject is one of domestic trade can be incredibly emotional and muddle-headed when it becomes one of foreign trade. In the latter field, they can seriously advocate or acquiesce in principles which they would think it insane to apply in domestic business. A typical example is the belief that the government should make huge loans to foreign countries for the sake of increasing our exports, regardless of whether or not these loans are likely to be repaid. American citizens, of course, should be allowed to lend their own funds abroad at their own risk. The government should put no arbitrary barriers in the way of private lending to countries with which we are at peace. As individuals, we should be willing to give generously for humane reasons alone to people who are in great distress or in danger of starving. But we ought always to know clearly what we are doing. It is not wise to bestow charity on foreign people under the impression that one is making a hard-headed business transaction purely for one's own selfish purposes. That could only lead to misunderstandings and bad relations later. Yet among the arguments put forward in favor of huge foreign lending, one fallacy is always sure to occupy a prominent place. It runs like this. Even if half or all the loans we make to foreign countries turn sour and are not repaid, this nation will still be better off for having made them because they will give an enormous impetus to our exports. It should be immediately obvious that if the loans we make to foreign countries to enable them to buy our goods are not repaid, then we are giving the goods away. A nation cannot grow rich by giving goods away. It can only make itself poorer. No one doubts this proposition when it is applied privately. If an automobile company lends a man $5,000 to buy a car priced at that amount, and the loan is not repaid, the automobile company is not better off because it has quote-unquote sold the car. It has simply lost the amount that it costs to make the car. If the car costs $4,000 to make, and only half the loan is repaid, then the company has lost $4,000 minus $2,500, or a net amount of $1,500. It is not made up in trade what it lost in bad loans. If this proposition is so simple when applied to a private company, why do apparently intelligent people get confused about it when applied to a nation? The reason is that the transaction must be traced mentally through a few more stages. One group may indeed make gains, while the rest of us take the losses. It is true, for example, that persons engaged exclusively or chiefly in export business might gain on net balance as a result of bad loans made abroad. The national loss on the transaction would be certain, but it might be distributed in ways difficult to follow. The private lenders would take their losses directly. The losses from government lending would ultimately be paid out of increased taxes imposed on everybody. But there would also be many indirect losses brought about by the effect on the economy of these direct losses. In the long run, business and employment in America would be hurt, not helped, by foreign loans that were not repaid. For every extra dollar that foreign buyers had with which to buy American goods, domestic buyers would ultimately have $1 less. Businesses that depend on domestic trade would therefore be hurt in the long run as much as export businesses would be helped. Even many concerns that did in export business would be hurt on net balance. American automobile companies, for example, sold about 15% of their output in the foreign market in 1975. It would not profit them to sell 20% of their output abroad as a result of bad foreign loans if they thereby lost, say, 10% of their American sales as a result of added taxes taken from American buyers to make up for the unpaid foreign loans. None of this means, I repeat, that it is unwise for private investors to make loans abroad, but simply that we cannot get rich by making bad ones. For the same reasons that it is stupid to give a false stimulation to export trade by making bad loans or outright gifts to foreign countries, it is stupid to give a false stimulation to export trade through export subsidies. An export subsidy is a clear case of giving the foreigner something for nothing by selling him goods for less than it costs us to make them. It is another case of trying to get rich by giving things away. In the face of all this, the United States government has been engaged for years in a quote-unquote foreign economic aid program, the greater part of which has consisted in outright government-to-government gifts of many billions of dollars. Here we are interested in just one aspect of that program: the naive belief of many of its sponsors that this is a clever or even a necessary method of quote-unquote increasing our exports, and so maintaining prosperity and employment. It is still another form of the delusion that a nation can get rich by giving things away. What conceals the truth from many supporters of the program is that what is directly given away is not the exports themselves, but the money with which to buy them. It is possible, therefore, for individual exporters to profit on net balance from the national loss if their individual profit from the exports is greater than their share of taxes to pay for the program. Here we have simply one more example of the error of looking only at the immediate effect of a policy on some special group, and of not having the patience or intelligence to trace the long-run effects of the policy on everyone. If we do trace these long-run effects on everyone, we come to an additional conclusion, the exact opposite of the doctrine that has dominated the thinking of most government officials for centuries. This is, as John Stuart Mill so clearly pointed out, that the real gain of foreign trade to any country lies not in its exports, but in its imports. Its consumers are either able to get from abroad commodities at a lower price than they could obtain them for at home, or commodities that they could not get from domestic producers at all. Outstanding examples in the United States are coffee and tea. Collectively considered, the real reason a country needs exports is to pay for its imports. All right, that concludes today's read. Now on to the analysis and review part of the video. All right, welcome to the analysis and review part of the video. So as I've mentioned in the previous read, this is part of a greater series that Hazlitt does. It's about 5 or so chapters on commodities exchange and foreign markets. And this is about as complex as this gets. And as I mentioned in the previous read, this book is designed to be an introduction to the world of economics. So if the lesson has gone over your head, don't feel like you're out of the loop in any of this. This is as complicated as it's going to get. And it's really a lesson that Smith goes over in The Wealth of Nations, I think in greater detail than Hazlitt possibly could in an introductory economics book. So if you really want to get the lesson in its fullest form, then I would really suggest looking into Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, which we'll actually be referencing in this analysis and review several times. So I'll put a link in this video's description to that read, which I did on this channel. He focuses on that in books 2 and 3, and also in book 1. So it's primarily book 2 that he spends his time on commodities exchange and foreign markets, and the lesson that we're going to go into today, which is, and I'm going to try to simplify this and make this as short a video as I possibly can, because I'm going to do a bit of a reductionist take on this so that I can simplify the lesson as much as possible. All Hazlitt is saying is to do not obsess yourself with exports. This is something that Smith actually had to spend a great amount of length, hundreds and hundreds of pages going over, even in 1776, because this was a fallacy, the obsession with exports that existed and was commonplace even then, and is still something that isn't quite understood well today. So the simplest way I can explain the lesson beyond just simply the lesson itself, do not obsess yourself with exports, is that, as Smith pointed out, free trade, free exchange in both domestic and foreign markets is a good thing. So both imports and exports, where mutually consensual, are always to everyone's benefit. So what we should get from that is we shouldn't interfere with those mutually consensual transactions. It is to no economic benefit when I say should, I mean to say that it is to no one's economic benefit to interfere with mutually consensual transactions wherever they take place. So there may be, Hazlitt does mention that in wartime, you may make a consideration as a nation not to do business with, say, an enemy, but that is going to come with an economic cost, and that engaging in this type of transaction and this type of interference is something where you have to accept that there is going to be an economic loss suffered from the nation that imposes that restriction. So what we're going to extrapolate this to is a really common misnomer, and that I think even Donald Trump, and I hate to get political, but it's something where I don't think he quite understands this lesson here, which is that exports need not be greater than imports in terms of the specific goods exchanged. How do we know that? Again, this is part of Smith's lesson. Everyone is benefited by mutually consensual transactions. So if at face value it looks like we are importing quote unquote more than we're exporting, if that's just the if that's just the natural tendency of things, then there is not an economic benefit or gain to interfere with those mutually consensual transactions. And I've said it before 1,000 times, I'll say it again. I'll put a link in this video's description to my series on interference that goes into that lesson in much greater detail. So where does this obsession lead us? And this is basically where Hazlitt is going to introduce the actual debunking here. What this leads us to is to bad debt, both in the private and public sector. So in the case of bad debt, in order to bolster up, we'll call it exports, all we're doing is just transferring the funding mechanism. We're just transferring who's paying the bill. And again, as Smith's lesson teaches us, the person who should be paying the bill is the person who is most willing to pay the bill. And if we transfer that onto, say, a governing body, then what we've done, in effect, is removed that level of consent. So this is something that he points out on page 89. Here we are interested in just one aspect of that program, the naive belief of many of its sponsors that this is a clever or even a necessary method of quote-unquote increasing our exports and so maintaining prosperity and employment. It does actually the exact opposite of that, because in the end, the way it's going to have to get paid for is either with increased taxation, which again is done through coercion and not mutual consent. So we know that that's going to be an increased cost to doing business and that nobody wins as a result of this, or through the printing of cash. So in the case of printing of cash, what we have is the excess of supply of a good. If it's just cash, what happens when the amount of cash that's in the market, we'll say, is arbitrarily increased? In this case, we have an excess of supply. And whenever you have an excess of supply, the value of the thing, the price of the thing, tends to decline. And that means that if you already have cash, if you already have assets, then the exchange value of that cash and those assets will tend to decline. So in that way, you obviously become poorer and less well off because of the printing of cash used to fund these bad debt programs. Now, this isn't to say, and this is why it's an axiomatic bad. We know this, it's an axiomatic bad, again, because these transactions are being conducted through coercion rather than through mutually consensual exchange. So Hazlitt does point out briefly that this is not to say that private charity is bad. It's just to say that private charity should be treated as charity and not some sort of net balance gain to our society. So the last thing I want to talk about is the final sentence, which is about as complicated as I want to get in this analysis and review. So if you can understand that exports aren't something we should be hyper obsessed with, that we shouldn't be having an all-cost approach to bolster. In the case of both imports and exports, it is to no one's benefit to artificially inflate or deflate either of them. Again, this is Smith's lesson. So the final sentence reads as follows. Collectively considered, the real reason a country needs exports is to pay for its imports. And that's a reference to a previous sentence he put from the same page on page 89. This is, as John Stuart Mill so clearly pointed out, that the real gain of foreign trade to any country lies not in its exports, but in its imports. So I'm going to try my best to give you the shortest explanation of why that's the case, and the clearest and most simple explanation of why that's the case. A self-sufficient country needs no imports. What does that mean? If we have everything we need and we don't need to get anything from any other country, we don't need to do any business with them. If we have the best TVs in the world and we can get them and there's no comparative advantage to importing them from any other country, we're not going to. We're self-sufficient. We have all the TVs we need. We're not going to bring them in. But if a country introduces a newer and better TV, or introduces a method of producing the TV which creates a comparative advantage, say lower cost, then we could realize and capture that lower cost by importing the good that we're already consuming, the television. When we are so self-sufficient that we have an excess of supply of something, we tend to export it. Because if we can't sell to our own market, of course we're going to sell to a foreign market. And it may be that we export something to a foreign market, not because we have a necessary excess of supply here, but because the demand in a foreign country is, say, so much in excess of the demand here that we realize and can capture a comparative advantage, a competitive advantage in this case, to export that good and have somebody else be paying for that good. Here's the lesson that needs to be extrapolated from all of this. And we can do this by seeing this from the perspective of the other country. They wouldn't be doing business with us. They wouldn't be buying our goods and services unless they created an advantage for them. And they wouldn't be selling us their own goods, and this is the big lesson, unless they can get something in return. So when we introduce, it seems from the perspective of the other country, they won't do business with us unless they have something to give, unless we have something to give them. Yes. So, and when we introduce currency, which is nothing more than a medium of exchange to all of this, the British pound sterling that we get by exporting our goods is completely useless unless we have something we can buy with those British pound sterling. In the end, no matter how many times it circulates, there must be something that we are importing to get from England. In that case, what we've basically proved here is that what we really care about is the imports. Again, if we're self-sufficient, then we have everything we need. We really aren't gained in any way by the exports, except in terms of the cash that it brings us, the cash value, if we're exchanging in gold or something like that. So in the case of the exchange, what we care about is what's coming in. If we have so much wheat that we can't possibly eat all of it, then we export it. But we won't bother to export it unless we can get something in return. And if it's the British pound sterling that we're getting in return, that's meaningless until we can turn that into a tangible commodity or service, right? So eventually that British pound sterling has to get recycled back to England. At some point, somebody has to take those British pound sterling and turn them into a thing that we actually care about. A plow. Maybe the plow technologies in Great Britain are better than they are here. So we import those plows to our fields to produce the wheat. And we pay for the importation of those plows with the exportation of the excess wheat that we already begin with. So in this case, exports aren't the end. They are a means to an end. What I really want is the TV. So I export wheat so I can get British pound sterling so that in the end I can get the TV from England, say, because let's say they make better TV. This is something that, again, is a lesson that Smith spent an awful lot of The Wealth of Nations going over. So I'll, again, highly recommend checking that out if you want to delve into a much more complex and lengthy read. Hopefully that's made things clear. We'll continue in this series on that lesson, at least. Hopefully I've cleared up that lesson, which can get very complicated and difficult to understand. So hopefully I've cleared that up a little bit for everybody at home. We'll continue with Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson in our next read with Chapter 13, which is entitled Parity Prices. So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.